The desert was vast and endless, stretching as far as the human eye could wander. Day after day, the winds carried fine grains of golden sand across the flat earth, and the sun rose like a great fire in the eastern sky, pouring its warmth over the land of Babylon. To most who lived there, the desert was ordinary. Its heat, its dust, and its dry winds were simply part of life. But to one man, this land would become the canvas for something extraordinary. That man was King Nebuchadnezzar II, ruler of Babylon. His city was already powerful, its walls thick and tall, its temples rich with offerings, and its people busy with trade. Merchants carried spices, gold, and precious stones into Babylon's gates. Artisans carved clay tablets with writing, and priests studied the stars from tall ziggurats. To the outside world, Babylon was already magnificent. Yet, for Nebuchadnezzar, something was missing. He was not only a king but also a husband. His queen, Amytis of Media, had traveled from the lush green mountains of her homeland to live with him in this desert city. She had left behind rolling hills covered with forests, valleys bright with flowers, and cool rivers that sang as they ran over stones. In Babylon, she found instead dry winds, endless sands, and a sky that gave little shade. At first, she hid her sadness. She wore her crown gracefully, smiled at the banquets, and walked proudly beside the king. But in quiet moments, when the moon rose over the desert, she would sigh softly. She missed the whisper of pine trees, the scent of mountain flowers, the cool mist of rivers. Her heart longed for home. Nebuchadnezzar noticed. He watched her as she looked out from the palace balcony, her gaze searching for something that the desert could not offer. The king, though powerful and feared, was also a man who loved deeply. He did not want his queen to live in longing. He wanted her to feel a home, even here in Babylon. And so, one evening, as the stars lit up the night sky and the city settled into silence, Nebuchadnezzar made a vow to himself. He would bring the mountains to Babylon. He would bring rivers, flowers, trees, and cool shade into the heart of the desert. He would create a wonder so great that his queen would no longer feel sorrow but joy. That was the birth of the dream, the vision of the hanging gardens of Babylon. The king began to imagine it clearly in his mind. He pictured terraces rising one above the other, stacked like steps climbing toward the sky. Each terrace would be wide and strong, built of stone, and covered with rich soil. On these terraces, trees would grow, their roots deep in the earth above the palace. Flowers would spill over the edges, vines would cascade like green waterfalls, and fruit would hang heavy from branches. From a distance, it would look like a mountain built by human hands, a mountain in the heart of the desert, crowned not with snow but with gardens. And when the queen stood upon it, she would look out over green leaves, hear the sound of water flowing, and breathe in the scent of roses and lilies. But to turn vision into reality was no small task. The king called his wisest architects, engineers, and builders. He gathered them into the palace hall and spoke of his plan. Many were silent at first, for it seemed impossible. How could such gardens live in the desert? Where would the water come from? How could stone bear the weight of so many trees? Yet the king's will was law, and his dream was greater than their doubts. Slowly, the architects began to plan. They studied clay tablets of mathematics, they drew marks upon wax boards, and they whispered to one another late into the night. The chosen place was near the royal palace, close to the Euphrates River that flowed through Babylon. The river was life. It gave water to the fields and strength to the city. From it, the engineers believed, water could be drawn and lifted to the gardens above. Workers began clearing the land. Great blocks of stone were dragged by oxen and men, rolling over logs, moved inch by inch. Sweat poured under the desert sun. and the ground shook with the sound of hammers striking rock. Slowly, a foundation was laid. Pillars rose, strong and thick, carved with care to carry the weight of what would come. The air was filled with the smell of heated tar and bitumen, for the builders sealed the stones so that no water would seep through. They laid reeds, bricks, and lead to create terraces that could hold not only soil but entire groves of trees. The city watched with wonder. Children ran to see the rising terraces, merchants spoke of it in the marketplace, and travelers carried the story beyond Babylon's gates. Some doubted, some laughed, but many believed they were witnessing the birth of something the world had never seen before. Through all this, Queen Amytis did not yet know the full extent of the king's plan. She saw the building, of course, the rising terraces of stone, but no one told her the secret. Nebuchadnezzar wished for it to be a gift, a surprise that would bloom before her eyes. At night, as they dined together, he would ask her of her homeland. What flowers grew in her valleys? What fruits ripened in her orchards? What trees gave her shade? She would smile gently, her voice soft, as she described the mountain pines, the fragrant jasmines, the pomegranates that burst with sweet red seeds. The king listened closely, as though her words were seeds he himself would plant. And indeed, they were. Messengers and caravans were sent far and wide to bring back what she described. From distant mountains came pine and cedar saplings. From gardens across the east came roses, lilies, and irises. From orchards came figs, dates, and pomegranates. Seeds were gathered in clay jars, roots wrapped in moist earth, all carried carefully by camel and cart to Babylon. The desert city, once golden and dry, was now welcoming living gifts from across the world. As the first plants were carried into the city, the palace of Babylon was grand, with tall walls of glazed bricks, shimmering in blues and golds. From its gates, one could see the wide streets filled with merchants, priests, and travelers. Yet, within the heart of the palace, there was a gentle silence, broken only by the sound of footsteps along marble floors or the low murmur of servants preparing for the day. In that palace lived Queen Amytis, the woman for whom the king's dream of the gardens had begun. She was noble and kind, with eyes that held both strength and quiet sorrow. For though she was queen of the richest city in Mesopotamia, she often felt far from home. Memories of the mountains. Amytis was born among the green mountains of Media. In her childhood, she had walked among tall trees whose branches swayed in the cool winds. She had played beside rivers that rushed over smooth stones, and she had gathered flowers in meadows that rolled endlessly beneath the sky. Her people lived close to the earth, planting seeds in fertile soil, listening to the voices of the streams, and watching the seasons turn with grace. When she married Nebuchadnezzar and came to Babylon, she left behind that world. The desert was different, grand in its own way, but harsh and unyielding. Here the air was dry, and the earth was pale. The sky was a blaze of heat by day and an empty dome by night. She missed the whispering pines of her childhood, the cool rains, and the fragrance of wild blossoms. Often, at night, she would dream. In those dreams, she walked once more in her homeland. She could feel the wet grass beneath her feet, hear the wind through cedar branches, and taste the sweetness of ripe fruit. But when she awoke, the dream would fade, replaced by the silence of the desert night, the king's gentle watch. Nebuchadnezzar was a ruler feared and respected across the land. Yet, when he looked upon Amytis, he was not the king of armies and stone walls. He was simply a husband who wished for his wife's happiness. He noticed how her eyes softened when she spoke of her homeland. He noticed the way her hand lingered upon a sprig of herbs brought by a merchant from distant lands. He heard the sigh in her breath when she stood at the palace balcony, staring at the horizon as if searching for the mountains that were no longer there. At times, he would sit beside her and ask gently, "Tell me of your home." And Amytis would smile, her voice quiet but filled with longing. The mountains rise like guardians of the earth. Their peaks touch the clouds, and in the valleys, rivers sing. There are orchards where pomegranates grow heavy, and fields where flowers bloom in every color. The air smells of pine, and the soil is rich with life. Nebuchadnezzar would listen carefully. Each word she spoke was like a seed planted in his mind, and in his heart, he was already imagining how he might bring those mountains into Babylon. The people whisper. While Amytis carried her longing quietly, the people of Babylon began to whisper of the great work rising near the palace. The terraces were growing higher, stone upon stone, sealed and strengthened to hold something unseen. Workers carried baskets of soil, engineers tested channels for water, and strange plants were arriving from distant lands. Merchants spoke of it in the markets. Children asked their mothers what the king was building. Some said it would be a temple, others a fortress. Few guessed the truth, that it was to be a garden for the queen, a gift unlike any ever given. Amytis herself remained unaware. She saw the building, yes, but she did not know its purpose. Nebuchadnezzar kept the secret, for he wished the day of its completion to be a moment of wonder. Longing in the desert. Still, the queen's heart felt the weight of distance. At night, she would walk alone in the palace courtyard. The desert air was cool after the sun had set, and the stars glittered like jewels. She would lift her face to the night breeze and close her eyes, pretending for a moment that she was home. Sometimes, she would hum a song of her childhood, a soft melody that spoke of rivers and rain. The servants who heard it would pause, touched by the sadness in her voice. For though she wore her crown with dignity, they too knew the queen longed for something beyond the desert's reach. Nebuchadnezzar, hearing her song from afar, felt the ache of her heart, and it only strengthened his resolve. He would not let her longing remain unanswered. He would give her mountains, rivers, and orchards here in Babylon. A promise in the silence. One evening, as the moon rose over the desert and cast its silver light upon the palace, Nebuchadnezzar, the dream of the gardens, was born in the heart of a king. Yet dreams are only air until hands shape them into stone and soil. For the hanging gardens to rise in Babylon, it was not only Nebuchadnezzar's vision that mattered, but the strength, skill, and devotion of countless men and women. They were the builders, the unseen hands behind the wonder. Their sweat mixed with the dust of Babylon, their songs echoed through the scaffolding, and their labor transformed what seemed impossible into something alive. The call of the king. When Nebuchadnezzar shared his vision with his court, the idea spread like fire through dry reeds. To some, it seemed madness. To others, it was glory waiting to be shaped. Messengers rode out across the empire, calling for stonecutters, carpenters, engineers, waterworkers, and gardeners. From distant villages they came, men hardened by lifting stone, men who knew the secret of carving wood, men who had seen rivers tamed into canals. They came to Babylon by foot, by cart, and by boat, drawn by the promise of silver coins and by the honor of working for their king. Each man and woman carried a different skill, and together they formed the great living machine that would build the hanging gardens. Stone and foundation. The first to work were the masons. Strong men with arms like oak branches, they carved and moved massive stones. The foundation of the terraces had to be unshakable, for upon them would stand not only soil but trees, water, and entire orchards. The masons shaped stone blocks so large that oxen groaned as they pulled them across the earth. Wooden rollers creaked, ropes strained, and men shouted in rhythm as they dragged each block into place. The air was filled with the ring of hammers and the scrape of stone upon stone. Beneath the desert sun, their bodies gleamed with sweat, but still they worked, knowing that what they built was no ordinary wall, no ordinary platform. This was a mountain rising from the flat earth, a mountain of human hands. To keep water from slipping through the stones, layers of reeds and tar were laid, sealed with thick bricks baked in fire. On top of these, sheets of lead were hammered flat and spread like silver blankets. Then came more stone, more brick, until each terrace could hold the weight of rivers. The engineer's secret. Yet stone and soil alone would not bring life. The true wonder of the gardens was water, for without it, the plants would wither in the desert heat. The king's engineers, men of clever minds and restless hands, gathered near the Euphrates River. They studied its currents, measured its rise and fall, and devised a way to lift its water upward into the terraces. Their secret was a system of chains, pulleys, and wheels. Enclosed in stone towers, a series of buckets dipped into the river. As workers turned great wooden wheels, the buckets rose upward, spilling water into channels that led across the gardens. From there, the water trickled downward, flowing from terrace to terrace, feeding the roots of every plant. To the common eye, it seemed as if water simply climbed the mountain on its own. But in truth, it was the quiet labor of men turning wheels in shadow, their hands blistered, their muscles burning, so that the queen above might walk among green leaves and hear the sound of falling streams. The gardener's touch. While masons laid stone and engineers lifted water, gardeners came with their own wisdom. They knew the language of seeds, the needs of roots, and the patience of growing things. The king had gathered plants from across his empire, cedar saplings from distant mountains, vines from warm valleys, flowers from cool meadows, fruits from orchards far away. All were carried carefully into Babylon. The gardeners unwrapped them with reverence, pressing roots into soil, patting earth gently over seeds, and whispering prayers to the gods of growth. They worked not with hammers or stone, but with watering jars, clay spades, and soft hands. Day by day, they watched green shoots pierce the soil. They guided vines to climb along walls, tied branches to supports, and scattered herbs where the air could carry their fragrance. To the queen's eyes, this work was hidden, but to the gardeners, it was sacred. For they were not merely planting a garden, they were planting joy itself. Songs of the workers. As days turned to weeks, and weeks to months, the terraces grew. The sound of labor never ceased, stone striking stone, water splashing in channels, men calling commands. Yet, in the evenings, when the sun sank and the air cooled, the workers sang. Their voices rose like a river, carrying simple songs of home, of family, of bread and wine. Some sang of distant mountains, some of the sea, some of the fields they had left behind. Their songs mingled with the rustle of leaves and the trickle of water, and for a moment, the building site itself felt like a living garden. Even Nebuchadnezzar would pause at times, listening from his palace balcony. He heard in their songs the heartbeat of the work, the living soul of the gardens. And though he was their king, he knew the gardens belonged not only to him but to all who had laid their hands upon stone and soil. A gift of love and labor. Slowly, terrace by terrace, the mountain of gardens rose higher. Soil filled the platforms, roots dug deep, and water ran freely. The workers began to see the shape of the dream. They looked upon the vines trailing down walls, the young trees spreading shade, the pools glimmering in sunlight, and they realized that they were building not only for a king and queen, but for time itself. They whispered among themselves, "This will be remembered. Long after we are gone, travelers will come to see what we have built. And when they ask how it came to be, they will say, it was made for love." And so the hanging gardens grew, stone by stone, seed by seed, song by song. A wonder awakens. By the time the first full season passed, the terraces were no longer empty. They were alive. Flowers colored the air, vines draped from walls, young trees reached upward, and the sound of water was constant and sweet. Though it was not yet complete, the workers often paused to marvel. A desert city now held a mountain of green. Birds nested among the branches. Butterflies drifted among the blossoms. The air, once dry and harsh, was cool and fragrant near the terraces. And still, the queen knew little of what was coming. The king guarded the secret closely, waiting for the day when the gift would be ready. But the builders, the true makers of the wonder, already knew. They were shaping more than stone and soil. They were shaping memory itself, something that would live in stories long after the desert winds had carried away their names. A garden begins not with stone, nor with water, but with something small and fragile, a seed. Within the tiny husk of a seed sleeps an entire world. Roots, stems, leaves, flowers, even fruit, all waiting for the right moment to awaken. And so it was with the hanging gardens of Babylon. When the terraces were laid and the channels carved for water, it was time for the first living things to enter the mountain of stone. That was the moment when the dream of the king began to breathe. Seeds from afar. Messengers and caravans had traveled across the empire to gather plants for the gardens. From the mountains of Media came seeds of pine and cedar, wrapped in damp cloth to keep them alive. From the valleys of Persia came bulbs of lilies and irises. From the east arrived seeds of cinnamon and saffron, carried in clay jars sealed with wax. From orchards near the Mediterranean came pomegranates, figs, and grapes, their seeds shining like gems within the fruits. Each seed, each root, each sapling was more than a plant. It was a memory of a place, a whisper of another land. To Queen Amytis, who longed for the forests and rivers of a home, these seeds would carry her mountains into Babylon. The gardeners received them with reverence. They unwrapped each bundle, pressed their fingers gently into the soil, and placed the seeds as if laying treasures in the earth. They knew that within those small shells slept the promise of shade, of fragrance, of life. The awakening of green. The first shoots came shyly, like children peeking out from behind a curtain. Small green stems pushed upward through the soil, trembling in the desert breeze. Leaves unfolded, delicate and soft, stretching toward the sun. The workers who passed by paused in wonder. They had moved stone, carried water, and built terraces with strength. But here was something their hands could not force. Here was life, fragile and quiet, rising on its own. Soon, more shoots followed. Vines curled along the walls, tender leaves spread wide, and roots reached deep into the moist earth. The terraces, once bare, began to show the first hints of green. The masons, who had spent months in sweat and dust, smiled as they saw the plants grow. Now, they said, the stones we laid are alive. The engineers, who had built the wheels and pulleys, listened to the trickle of water feeding the roots, and felt pride that their craft had given drink to life. Trees of memory. Among the first to be planted were trees. Saplings of cedar and pine were brought to stand on the upper terraces, their slender trunks swaying gently. The gardeners tied them to supports, gave them rich soil, and poured water at their roots. Day by day, the trees grew stronger. Their branches spread wide, their needles whispered in the breeze, and the scent of resin filled the air. These were the trees of Amytis' homeland, the guardians of her childhood. When she would one day see them, she would not feel only the desert's emptiness but the memory of mountains in the air. Fruit trees were planted as well, figs, pomegranates, and dates. Their blossoms promised sweetness to come. and their shade promised rest. To the gardeners, they were not only gifts for the queen, but for the city itself, for the fruits would one day feed the people. Flowers of every color. If the trees gave strength, the flowers gave joy. Gardeners scattered bulbs of lilies and tulips, planted roses along the edges of the terraces, and set irises in clusters. Herbs were tucked into corners, mint, thyme, basil, so that the air would carry their fragrance. When the first blooms opened, they brought color to the stone. Reds, yellows, blues, and whites spilled across the terraces like paint upon a canvas. Butterflies, drawn by the blossoms, fluttered among the petals, their wings like fragments of sky. Bees buzzed softly, gathering nectar. It was as if the gods themselves had touched the desert and turned it into paradise. The murmuring waters. Yet the most magical sound was not the rustle of leaves or the hum of bees, but the murmur of water. The engineer's hidden wheels and pulleys lifted water from the Euphrates, and it flowed gently across the terraces, feeding roots, filling small pools, and spilling in silver threads from one level to another. At night, when the workers rested and the city grew quiet, the water whispered through the stone channels. Its voice was soft, like a lullaby sung by the earth itself. The sound carried through the palace walls, and though Queen Amytis did not yet know the source, she often paused to listen. To her, it felt like a promise in the dark, the first walk of the king. When the first seeds had grown into blossoms and the terraces showed true life, Nebuchadnezzar came to walk among them. He stepped slowly along the paths of stone, his robe brushing against vines, his hand trailing across the leaves. He breathed deeply of the air, filled now with fragrance and coolness, and he smiled. This was no longer only his dream. It was real. A mountain of life had risen in the desert, and soon his queen would see it. But not yet. He wanted the gardens to grow fuller, the trees to spread wider, the flowers to bloom brighter. He wanted the day of her first walk there to be nothing less than wonder. Workers at rest. That evening, as the workers sat together sharing bread and dates, they looked upon what they had built. By the fading light of the sun, the terraces glowed with green and gold. Birds were already nesting in the branches, and the air was cooler near the gardens. An old mason, his hands scarred from stone, said quietly, "I have built many walls, many towers, but never have I seen stones turn into life. These gardens will outlive us all." A gardener replied, "They will live as long as water flows and roots drink, and perhaps, even if they fade, their story will remain." And all who heard him nodded, for they knew they were shaping not only for their time, but for all time. The queen's dream nears. In her chambers, Amytis dreamed again of her homeland. She dreamed of walking among trees, of streams winding through meadows, of flowers blooming along her path. But this time, when she awoke, the fragrance of real blossoms drifted faintly through her window. She frowned in surprise, not knowing whence it came. The king smiled but said nothing. Soon, very soon, she would walk into her dream made real. A garden without water is only a dream drawn on sand. The terraces of Babylon, stacked high with stone and soil, could not live on sunlight alone. Every tree, every vine, every blossom needed the gift of flowing water. But how could water rise so high, above the streets, above the palace, above the very city walls, when the river lay far below? The answer was a secret of brilliance, a weaving of human craft and nature's rhythm. Some called it sorcery, others called it the blessing of the gods. But those who labored in its making knew it was something both simpler and greater, an art born of patience, wood, stone, rope, and human hands. The whisper of the river. The Euphrates flowed endlessly, its waters brown and strong, carrying the soil of mountains and valleys alike. By day it glimmered beneath the sun. By night it reflected the stars like a dark mirror. For the Babylonians, the river was life. It fed their fields, filled their jars, turned their wheels. It was the thread that bound the city together. And now it was asked to do more, to climb the sky. Beside the river's edge, a wooden platform had been built. Upon it stood tall frames, carved with care, their beams fastened with bronze pins. From these frames hung wheels that turned slowly with the weight of clay jars tied along their rim. As one wheel dipped, jars sank into the river, filled themselves, and rose again, dripping and heavy. Higher and higher they climbed, spilling water into stone troughs. The water flowed onward, carried up step by step, lifted by wheels upon wheels, until it reached the base of the garden mountain. From there, channels hidden within the walls carried it upward still, until at last it spilled gently into the upper terraces. The silent engineers. The men who built these machines did not speak much of their work. They moved like shadows, tightening ropes, setting axles, and testing the weight of each jar. Their knowledge was handed down from father to son, secrets guarded as carefully as treasures. By day, they labored in silence. By night, they listened. For the water told its own story as it moved. The creak of wood, the splash of jars, the gurgle of streams. If a sound was wrong, they knew where to mend. If a wheel dragged, they knew where to oil. They were not poets or priests, yet in their craft was a kind of prayer, a devotion to balance, to flow, to life. A mountain of streams. Once the water reached the gardens, it did not rush. It did not flood. It spread gently, guided by stone channels hidden beneath the soil. These channels branched and rebranched, carrying water like veins through a living body. At the base of each tree, small basins were carved to hold the flow. Around the roots of vines, the channels bent and lingered. Pools were placed at intervals, their surfaces calm as glass, reflecting sky and leaf alike. From the highest terrace, thin rivulets trickled downward, spilling into lower pools in silver threads. The sound of the gardens became the sound of streams. Day and night, the water murmured, filling the air with peace. The desert winds grew cooler here, softened by mist. The sun itself seemed gentler, as though soothed by the shimmer of the water below. A walk with the king. One evening, Nebuchadnezzar walked with his chief engineer along the terraces. The sun was low, staining the sky with crimson, and the first stars trembled above. The king paused by a pool where lotus flowers floated, their petals closed for the night. "Tell me," he said softly, "will this water never fail?" The engineer bowed, his hand stained with oil and rope fibers. "As long as the river flows, my lord, the gardens will drink. And if the river falters, the gardens will thirst with the city alike." The king watched the water trickle down a narrow channel, curling around the roots of a fig tree. He thought of his queen, who would soon walk here. "Then we must guard the river as we guard the walls," he murmured. And the engineer nodded, for he knew the river was both lifeline and secret. Without it, the gardens would wither into dust. The first rainfall of Babylon. Though the skies above Babylon gave little rain, within the gardens it seemed as though rain had been captured and held forever. Drops clung to leaves, dripped from branches, and fell like silver pearls into the pools below. Children of the workers were sometimes allowed to wander at the edge of the terraces. They laughed and stretched out their hands, pretending the water falling from above was rain. They had never seen such a thing, for in Babylon the rain was rare and fleeting. But here, in the shadow of the terraces, it seemed endless. "Look," one child whispered, "the sky is falling." "No," another replied, "The sky is rising." And both were right, for the water climbed from the river to the heavens, then fell again in soft, endless circles. The queen's wonder. At last, the day came when Amytis was led to the gardens. The king took her hand and guided her through a stone archway into the terraces. She gasped softly, for she had expected stone, perhaps flowers. But she had not expected water. It trickled at her feet, it shimmered along the paths, it whispered from above. Everywhere, the air was alive with the sound of flowing streams. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, and for the first time since leaving her homeland, she felt the cool breath of mountains upon her skin. Nebuchadnezzar watched her silently, his heart full. Her smile was more than reward. It was the proof that the impossible had been made real. The dream of the workers. That night, the workers sat again by the river, where the wheels turned ceaselessly, lifting jars of water toward the sky. Some leaned back and closed their eyes, listening to the creak and splash. One of them, a young man whose father had also worked the river, spoke quietly. "Do you think the gods see us here, lifting water as though we command the river itself?" An older worker shook his head. "No, the gods do not see, but the children of our children will speak of this work, and that is enough." And in their hearts, they knew the truth. They had not only built a wonder for their king, they had built a wonder for all time. The gardens at night. When the moon rose high, the gardens glowed in silver light. Water caught the moon's reflection and carried it from pool to pool. Trees stood like sentinels, their leaves trembling gently. Flowers opened that only bloomed at night, spreading fragrance into the cool air. Amytis walked again, barefoot upon the smooth stones, listening to the lullaby of streams. Above her, vines spilled down like curtains of green. Around her, the air was alive with the chorus of frogs, crickets, and the distant call of night birds. She turned to her king and whispered, "You have given me the mountains. You have given me rain in a place without rain, and you have given me home." And Nebuchadnezzar, though a ruler of armies and empires, felt his heart soften, for he had built this not for conquest, but for love. Endless flow. So the water rose, day and night, lifted from the river to the sky, flowing through the terraces, falling again to the earth, and returning to the river once more. A circle without end, as steady as time itself. The hanging gardens were alive now, not only with stone and seed, but with the song of flowing water. They would be remembered not merely as a place of beauty, but as a place where the desert was taught to bloom. The city of Babylon often woke slowly. The streets stirred with merchants arranging their wares, with potters carrying jars, with bakers pulling bread from their clay ovens. The Euphrates shimmered with first light, its surface golden and soft. From the tall city walls, sentinels watched the horizon, when night gave way to morning. But within the hanging gardens, dawn was not simply the rising of the sun. It was a ceremony of its own, a quiet unveiling of color, fragrance, and sound. The terraces, wrapped in green and watered by the river's endless gift, greeted each day like a living temple to the morning. The first light. Long before the sun climbed high enough to touch the palace walls, its faintest rays brushed the tops of the terraces. The leaves caught that light first, glowing pale silver before deepening into green. Drops of water, left from the night's gentle trickling, glimmered like jewels upon the vines. Birds, which had nested within the branches of cedars and figs, stirred as the sky brightened. A dove cooed softly from the highest terrace. Sparrows darted between clusters of roses, their wings catching the growing light. A heron, having rested near one of the pools, stretched its wings and glided silently toward the river. For a moment, The gardens were not yet awake, but not asleep either. They lingered in that tender hour when night sighs into day. The walk of Amytis. Queen Amytis often chose this time to wander among the terraces. She would rise before her attendants, slip into a robe of light linen, and walk barefoot upon the stone paths. The coolness of the stone, kissed by night air, grounded her steps. She moved slowly, touching leaves as she passed, breathing deeply of the damp air. Here was mint, sharp and fresh. There was jasmine, sweet and faint. She paused by a tree heavy with figs, where the dew shone upon its fruit like crystal beads. The queen loved the stillness most. In the marketplace, the city never stopped its noise. But here, only the murmur of water and the song of birds filled her ears. It was as if the gardens themselves breathed with her, each leaf exhaling peace. Flowers unfolding. As the sun climbed higher, the flowers began their daily awakening. Lilies unfurled their white trumpets, stretching wide as though to sing. Roses opened layer by layer, releasing fragrance into the air. Bright marigolds lifted their heads, fiery against the green. Amytis watched as butterflies appeared, fluttering from blossom to blossom, their wings painted with morning light. She remembered the mountain meadows of her youth, where such colors danced across the fields. Here, in this crafted mountain of stone and water, the same beauty lived again. She whispered softly, "It is as though the earth itself has climbed to meet me." Pools of stillness. The water, carried tirelessly by the hidden wheels, gathered in pools upon the terraces. These pools, lined with smooth stone, were quiet mirrors of the sky. Fish swam slowly within them, gold and silver, gifts from distant lands. Their tails sent ripples across the surface, scattering the reflection of the morning sun. Amytis knelt by one such pool, dipping her fingers into the cool water. Tiny fish darted around her touch, flashing like sparks. The water felt alive, a thread connecting her hand to the river below, to the mountain she had left, to the very heartbeat of the earth. She listened to its trickle as it spilled gently from one terrace to another. It was a sound that soothed the deepest corners of her mind, a lullaby of eternity. The voices of the garden. Not only plants and water spoke in the gardens. Birds filled the air with their chorus, each voice joining the others in harmony. A nightingale sang from a hidden perch, its notes rising pure and clear. Bees buzzed steadily as they moved among the blossoms, their hum blending with the music of the streams. Even the leaves themselves had a voice. When the morning breeze drifted down from the terraces, it rustled through the branches, a soft applause to welcome the day. The queen sometimes closed her eyes and imagined that the gardens were whispering to her, that each rustle, each note, was a word meant only for her heart. The king's quiet pride. Often, Nebuchadnezzar would follow his queen, though from a distance. He would watch her walk among the terraces, her face serene, her hands brushing the blossoms. He saw how her shoulders, once heavy with longing, now rested at ease. He did not disturb her moments of peace, for they were sacred. But in his heart he carried pride, not the pride of conquest or empire, but the pride of having given her a gift no crown or throne could match. He had given her home. The gardener's care. As the sun rose fully, the gardeners appeared. They moved with quiet purpose, carrying baskets of soil, jars of water, and tools of wood and bronze. They trimmed vines, removed withered leaves, and scattered grain for the birds. Some knelt to whisper prayers to the gods of fertility and water, thanking them for the life that flourished here. Amytis greeted them kindly, for she knew these men and women were the true keepers of the gardens. Without their hands, the terraces would wither. They bowed to her, but she often bent down to touch their shoulders in return, a gesture of gratitude. The gardeners love her for this. and in her smile they found reason to tend each leaf with care. A place of rest. On the lower terraces, shaded by tall trees, benches of smooth stone had been placed. There, courtiers and guests sometimes gathered in the mornings. They spoke softly, not wishing to break the peace. Musicians sometimes played gentle notes upon lyres and flutes, their music mingling with the streams. The queen herself would sit there on some mornings, letting her eyes wander over the rising terraces above her. She often thought of them as a stairway between earth and heaven, where stone, water, and life rose together toward the sky. Fragrance of dawn. As the heat of day began to rise, the air filled more strongly with fragrance. Jasmine, rose, and mint mingled, carried by the breeze. Some said the very air of the gardens could cure sadness, for those who entered often left with lighter hearts. Travelers who later wrote of Babylon spoke of this fragrance. They said that before they even saw the gardens, they smelled them, the sweetness of flowers, the dampness of leaves, the freshness of water in a city of dust. To Amytis, the fragrance was not only pleasant, it was memory itself, for each scent carried her back to her homeland's valleys and groves. The morning's blessing. When the sun stood high enough to bathe the terraces in full light, the morning had truly arrived. The gardens now shone with colors vivid and bold, their leaves trembling in brilliance. The streams sparkled like threads of silver, the pools reflected skies of perfect blue. Amytis, standing at the highest terrace, spread her arms and closed her eyes. She whispered a blessing, not to any one god but to the earth itself. May you always breathe. May your waters never fail. May your roots hold strong. And in that moment, she felt as though the gardens themselves answered, with the rustle of leaves, the sparkle of streams, and the chorus of birds. The city awakens. Below the terraces, Babylon had fully awakened. The marketplace hummed, the forges clanged, the river carried boats heavy with grain and goods. Yet above it all, the gardens remained a world apart, a place of stillness in the heart of a restless empire. From the walls of the city, travelers looked up in wonder. They saw vines spilling like waterfalls, trees standing like sentinels, and glimpses of water glimmering in the sun. Some rubbed their eyes, unsure if what they saw was real or a vision. And those who were allowed within the palace whispered that at dawn, the hanging gardens were more than stone and leaf. They were a dream, caught in the waking light. The hanging gardens had become more than a secret of the palace. Word of their beauty began to spread beyond the walls of Babylon. Merchants whispered in marketplaces, travelers told tales in distant towns, and envoys carried stories to kings and queens across the lands. Yet none could truly imagine the terraces, the flowing water, the shade of trees in the desert, nor the colors of the blossoms dancing in sunlight. And so the first visitors who were invited, or brave enough, to approach the palace found themselves stepping into a wonder unlike anything the world had seen. Arrival at the city gates. Caravans creaked along the streets of Babylon, drawn by gold and spices and tales of the gardens. Dust clung to their wheels, camels who've struck rhythm on stone roads, and travelers peered eagerly at the walls rising high above them. When they reached the palace gates, guards in bronze helmets and flowing tunics halted them with courteous nods. Only those granted passage by the king or the queen could enter, for the gardens were private, a gift from the king to his queen, but also, the palace had learned, a gift for the world. Visitors paused to catch their breath. Even before seeing the terraces, they heard something extraordinary. The faint trickle of water, the distant coo of doves, the rustle of leaves carried on a desert breeze. Their hearts quickened, for they had never heard a sound like this in the dry, dusty city. First glimpse. When the gates opened, the first thing they saw was a staircase of stone ascending into green. Vines hung down like curtains, and at the top, A pool of water shimmered as though sunlight itself had become liquid. Flowers glowed with colors vivid and unimagined, and the air was cool, fragrant, and alive. Travelers stopped in awe. Some whispered prayers of thanks, others fell silent, unable to speak. Children clutched their mothers' hands and pointed, their eyes wide as they took in the scene. Even merchants, hardened by years of desert sun and trade, felt a lightness in their chests they could not name. The walk among terraces. The king sometimes led the first visitors, though more often he remained in shadow, watching quietly. The guests walked along terraces paved with smooth stone, bordered by flowers and shrubs. Water trickled past their feet in narrow channels, cascading gently into pools below. The air was fragrant with mint, rose, jasmine, and lilies. The gardens smelled of rain even though none had fallen in weeks, and travelers remarked that it was as if Babylon itself had been taught to breathe. Birds flitted from tree to tree, parrots with bright feathers, doves with soft cooing, sparrows that darted in playful arcs. The guests watched silently as butterflies rose in lazy spirals over blossoms, their wings catching sunlight like fragments of sky. Stories among visitors. While walking, travelers shared what they had seen with one another in whispers, for no one wished to disturb the serenity of the gardens. A merchant from Lydia said, "I have crossed mountains and deserts, yet I have never smelled air so sweet." A caravan leader from Arabia whispered, "The water, it flows as if the gardens themselves are alive, not built by men." An envoy from Egypt knelt beside a pool, dipping his fingers into the cool water. "I have seen the Nile," he said softly, "but its beauty pales compared to this." Even the king's scribes, who documented every wonder of the empire, found themselves writing slowly, carefully, as though each word must honor what their eyes had witnessed. The queen's greeting. Queen Amytis sometimes met visitors personally. She would walk along the terraces, her hand brushing against leaves and blossoms, her eyes bright with the joy of seeing others admire what had been born from her longing. She spoke gently, "May the gardens bring you peace, as they have brought me comfort. May their water cool your hearts, and their fragrance lift your spirits." Travelers were humbled. Some bent their knees in respect, some touched her hand lightly, as if connecting to the source of this paradise. To them, she was both queen and guardian of a miracle, a living bridge between desert and mountain, longing and fulfillment. Artists and poets. Among the first visitors were artists and poets. They carried clay tablets, papyrus scrolls, brushes, and pigments. Some painted the terraces with ink and color, trying to capture the brilliance of flowers, the shimmer of water, the softness of morning light. Poets wrote long verses, praising the king, the queen, and the workers who had made the gardens bloom. They described leaves trembling in gentle wind, flowers spilling color down terraces, and birds singing in chorus. Each verse tried, and failed, to fully capture the wonder, yet in attempting, they preserved its memory for generations to come. Travelers speak to workers. Curious visitors often ask the gardeners and engineers how the gardens were made. The workers, humble and patient, explained simply, "The water is lifted from the river," one said, "and carried through channels hidden beneath the terraces. Each plant is cared for daily, each vine guided along its path." "And the stones?" asked another visitor. "They support the gardens," a mason replied, "like bones support the body, but the life comes from the water and the hands that tend it." Visitors nodded, amazed that so much care, patience, and devotion could transform stone into living paradise. Night arrives again. As the day progressed, the visitors eventually had to leave, returning to streets of sand and sunlit markets. Yet the memory of the gardens lingered in their hearts. Some wrote letters to distant kings and queens. Others told stories to children around fires at night. The legend of the Hanging Gardens began to spread far and wide, carried in word, in song, and in awe. But even as the city grew noisy and the markets bustled, the gardens themselves remained a quiet sanctuary. Trees, blossoms, and streams moved as if in eternal calm, untouched by the clamor of the world below. A promise carried forward. Even among travelers, there was a sense that the gardens were a promise, not only to the queen who had inspired them, but to all who might one day dream of beauty and longing. They whispered to one another that what they had seen was more than a garden. It was proof that human hands, guided by heart and devotion, could lift a dream into reality. And long after the travelers returned to their homelands, their stories carried the scent of jasmine, the shimmer of water, and the cool shade of the terraces. They spoke of a place where the desert had learned to bloom, where longing and love had shaped stone, soil, and sky. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon had become a marvel known throughout the ancient world. Travelers whispered of them in distant lands, scribes wrote of them on clay tablets, and envoys carried tales of stone terraces that held mountains of green. Yet for all who saw the gardens, much of their wonder remained hidden, held in secrets known only to the king, the queen, and the hands that built them. Stories across the desert. In towns and villages far from Babylon, people spoke of a garden that floated above the city walls. Some said it was the work of the gods, who had descended from the sky to teach the desert to bloom. Others claimed it was a palace of spirits, where nature itself had taken human form. Merchants told travelers, "They say water flows from the sky, carrying life to terraces high above the city. Trees grow where no seed should survive. Flowers bloom where the sun is fiercest." Children dreamed of the Hanging Gardens. They imagined climbing endless stairs of stone to reach pools of crystal water, hiding among vines thick as walls, and plucking fruit that shimmered in the sun. To them, the gardens were both real and magical, a bridge between the ordinary world and the realm of wonder. The secret of the builders. Few outside the palace knew the truth. The gardens were built by hands that understood water, soil, stone, and patience. Wheels and pulleys lifted river water to terraces high above the city. Masonry was shaped to hold soil and life. Gardeners cared for every plant, pruning, watering, and guiding each vine along its path. The engineers, masons, and gardeners were sworn to secrecy. They worked quietly, often at night, so that the magic of the gardens seemed to come from the air itself rather than human hands. Even the queen, who walked daily among the terraces, did not know all the secrets. She saw flowing water and thriving plants, but she could not see the hidden channels beneath the stones, the pulleys turning silently in towers, or the careful calculation of each terrace's slope. Legends begin. Over time, legends formed. In some towns, the gardens were said to float in the clouds, visible only to those who could dream. In others, they were called the King's Mountain of Paradise, where love and longing had raised nature above the desert. Travelers described flowers that never faded, water that sang lullabies, and birds that spoke in human voices. Merchants exaggerated tales to draw attention to their goods. Scribes embellished stories to entertain the rich, and poets turned the gardens into metaphors of divine beauty and eternal longing. And yet, the truth of stone, soil, water, and hands was the quiet foundation upon which the legends rested. Hidden corners. Even within the gardens themselves, some places were rarely seen. Hidden pools collected water in shaded nooks. Secret paths twisted between terraces, where vines formed natural tunnels. The king had placed small pavilions where he could walk unseen, observing the gardens in silence, listening to the water and birds, and thinking of his queen. It was said that these hidden corners held the most beauty. Flowers that bloomed in secret colors, vines draped like curtains, and the air was cool and fragrant with herbs that grew only in shadow. Those rare few who discovered these corners felt as though they had entered another world, one untouched by time or human eyes. The whispering streams. The most magical secret, however, lay in the water. Though the engineers had made it flow with precision, the stream seemed to carry a life of their own. When the wind blew through the terraces, it created patterns of sound, soft gurgles, delicate splashes, and a faint hum that could calm the mind. Visitors often claimed the water whispered. Some said it spoke the language of the mountains that Amytis had left behind. Others believed it carried messages from the gods, offering guidance or blessings. In truth, the whisper was born of engineering, stone channels, waterfalls, and hidden conduits, but it became part of the legend. People believed magic had touched the gardens, and in a way, they were right. The magic was human, woven from love, longing, and devotion. The Queen's secret joy. Amytis herself kept a quiet secret. She had walked in deserts, seen cities crumble, and experienced the loneliness of a world far from home. The gardens were her refuge, her mountain, her memory made tangible. She would sometimes wander alone at night, listening to the water, touching leaves, inhaling the fragrance of jasmine and mint. In those moments, she felt at home. The gardens were her secret world, yet their beauty also belonged to everyone who entered. And still, she marveled at the skill of the workers. She wondered at the hidden channels, the pulleys that lifted water, the careful shaping of stone to hold soil and life. Though she did not know every detail, she sensed the devotion behind each terrace, each blossom, each drop of water. Visitors carry the tales. Envoys from distant kingdoms carried tales of the gardens to kings and queens across the known world. Some described the hanging gardens as a gift from the gods. Others claimed they were the work of sorcerers. A poet in Egypt wrote of the gardens as a stairway to paradise, where love had conquered the desert and longing had turned stone to life. A merchant in Lydia described waters that sang at night, as if the moon itself had learned to fall in streams. These stories spread, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes softened in myth. Yet all agreed that Babylon, desert city of sun and dust, held a wonder unlike any other. The secret continues. The builders continued their work even as legends grew. Engineers maintained the pulleys and channels, gardeners tended to hidden blooms, and masons repaired terraces that showed wear from sun and rain. For them, the truth mattered more than the stories. The gardens would last because of care, not because of legend. And in that care lay a quiet magic, as enduring as the stone terraces themselves. Even the king, proud as he was, knew that the secret of the garden's life lay not in the empire or its wealth, but in the hands that built, the hearts that tended, and the queen who inspired. Eternal mystery. Long after the visitors left, long after the scribes recorded tales, the gardens remained a place of quiet wonder. The city below continued its clamor, but within the terraces, time slowed. Water trickled, flowers bloomed, birds sang, and the wind whispered through leaves. Some corners remained untouched, some secrets never revealed. Perhaps that was part of the magic, that even in a place so carefully shaped, mystery endured. The hanging gardens were not only stone and soil, water and seed. They were longing made tangible, devotion given form, and dreams lifted above the desert. And as long as water flowed, as long as leaves trembled in the breeze, and as long as flowers opened each morning, the gardens whispered their story to all who listened. The hanging gardens of Babylon had grown beyond stone, water, and soil. They had become a living mountain, a paradise suspended above the city, a bridge between memory, longing, and life itself. The terraces now reached their full height, covered in every shade of green, every color of flower, and every note of bird song. In the early morning, as the sun painted the sky with gold and rose, the gardens breathed with a quiet majesty. Streams of water trickled down terraces, pools reflected the sky, and every leaf glistened with dew. To stand within them was to step into another world, one untouched by time or desert heat, the fullness of life. By now, the trees were tall and strong, their branches heavy with leaves and fruit. Vines hung from terraces like draperies of green, twisting in intricate patterns around stone columns. Flowers bloomed in endless waves of red, yellow, blue, and white. Herbs scented the air, cooling it with their gentle fragrance. Even the smallest creatures found refuge here. Birds nested in trees, bees hummed in unison across blossoms, and butterflies rose and fell like pieces of living sunlight. The gardens were not only for humans, they were a sanctuary for life in every form. The terraces now seemed endless, rising above the city in layers of green and gold, each level a world of its own, each pool a mirror reflecting heaven. The Queen's morning. Queen Amytis often rose before the sun to walk through the gardens. She loved to feel the cool stone beneath her feet, to watch the first light touch leaves and flowers, and to listen to the soft murmur of water flowing from terrace to terrace. On this particular morning, she paused at a balcony of the highest terrace. Below her, the city stretched in geometric patterns, its dust and stones softened by the shadow of the gardens. She breathed deeply, inhaling the fragrance of jasmine and mint. The air felt alive, as if the terraces themselves were breathing with her. She whispered softly to herself, "Here, I am home. Here, I am complete." Streams like silver threads. The water, lifted tirelessly from the Euphrates by hidden wheels and pulleys, now flowed freely through every terrace. Streams curved around roots, poured into pools, and fell in gentle cascades, their sound as soft as a lullaby. Visitors often remarked that the water seemed magical. It did not stagnate, it did not dry, it always returned in perfect rhythm, as if the gardens themselves held a secret that no human hand could fully master. The engineers who tended the pulleys smiled quietly, knowing the secret. It was not magic, it was patience, skill, and devotion. But in the way water danced in sunlight, it seemed as if the gods themselves had touched the gardens. Color and fragrance. Flowers bloomed in abundance, each terrace a riot of color. Roses, tulips, lilies, and marigolds painted the terraces with their vivid hues. The air carried the scent of jasmine, mint, and basil, mingled with the softer perfume of night-blooming flowers. The Queen walked slowly among them, touching petals gently, inhaling deeply. Each flower reminded her of a place left behind, a memory made alive in stone and soil. The terraces were more than gardens. They were a tapestry of her life, woven with care, longing, and love. Even the workers paused occasionally to admire the beauty they had created. The masons who had laid stones, the engineers who lifted water, and the gardeners who nurtured every plant, all felt pride, knowing that their hands had shaped something eternal. Birds and wildlife. The gardens had become a haven for birds and small animals. Parrots and doves perched among the branches, their songs blending with the hum of bees and the murmur of streams. Sparrows darted in playful arcs, while small mammals hid in shaded nooks. Visitors often marveled at the harmony of life. Unlike the bustling city below, where every footstep disturbed dust and stone, the terraces moved in rhythm with nature itself. Each creature had its place, each bird its song, each leaf its sway. The city below. From the heights of the terraces, the city of Babylon appeared almost small. its busy streets and dusty squares softened by the shadow of the gardens. Merchants, soldiers, and citizens went about their daily lives, unaware of the paradise that hovered above them. Yet the gardens influenced the city. The air beneath the terraces was cooler, shaded, and fragrant. Even the streets closest to the walls felt the presence of water, greenery, and life. Travelers often said that Babylon itself seemed to rise in stature when viewed from the heights of the Hanging Gardens. The workers' legacy. Those who had built the gardens now saw the fruits of their labor. Engineers watched water flow in perfect harmony. Gardeners admired blossoms and fruits thriving beyond their dreams. Masons walked along terraces lined with stone, knowing their work would last for generations. One gardener, an elderly man with hands worn by soil, whispered to a young apprentice, "We planted more than seeds. We planted hope. We built not only for the queen or the king, but for everyone who would one day walk here and breathe this air." The apprentice nodded, feeling the weight and joy of that truth. They had created a mountain of life in a desert, a testament to human devotion and imagination. Evening light. As the sun began to set, the gardens changed once again. Light fell at a softer angle, painting leaves and flowers with gold and amber. Pools reflected the fiery sky, and streams glimmered like molten silver. Birds sang the last songs of the day, and the fragrance of flowers grew richer in the cooling air. Amytis paused on the highest terrace, watching the gardens bathed in evening light. She thought of distant mountains, of childhood memories, and of the love that had made this paradise possible. She whispered softly, "The gardens live, and so does memory, and so does love." A place beyond time. In the heart of Babylon, the gardens stood eternal. They were no longer only a gift to the queen or a wonder to the king. They were a symbol of human possibility. Stone, soil, water, and care had been transformed into life, beauty, and memory. The Hanging Gardens would inspire or for centuries. Travelers would speak of them, poets would write verses, and legends would grow around their name. Yet within their walls, life continued in quiet perfection. Water flowed, flowers bloomed, birds sang, and the wind whispered through leaves. The gardens were a place beyond time, where desert and dream met, where longing became reality, and where the heart of a queen and the hands of workers shaped something eternal. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon had reached their full glory, yet their story did not end with stone, water, or life alone. Even as centuries passed, when the hands that built them had long rested and the queens and kings were gone, the gardens remained in memory, in story, and in the quiet imagination of those who had seen or heard of them. For every stone laid, every seed planted, and every stream carried, the gardens had become more than a place. They had become a promise of beauty, love, and devotion. Stories carried across time. Travelers and envoys carried tales of the gardens far beyond Babylon's walls. Kings in distant lands spoke of a paradise that floated above a desert city. Merchants whispered to their children about flowers that never faded and water that sang at night. Poets immortalized the gardens in verses, each line a reflection of wonder and longing. Even when the gardens were no longer visible to the world, their stories lived on. They were repeated around fires, written on scrolls, and remembered in dreams. People imagined the terraces, the streams, the flowers, and the trees as vividly as if they had walked among them themselves. In this way, the Hanging Gardens became eternal, not only in stone and soil, but in the hearts and minds of countless generations. The Queen's eternal presence. Queen Amytis, who had inspired the gardens with her longing for home, became a symbol of devotion and love. Even after her life in the palace ended, her presence lingered in the terraces she had cherished. She had walked among flowers at dawn, listened to the whispering streams at night, and marveled at the harmony of life on each terrace. Her footsteps had left a quiet imprint, her care had nurtured the first seeds, and her longing had turned stone into a living paradise. In the hearts of those who tended the gardens, and in the minds of visitors, her spirit remained. She had shown that even in the harshest desert, a dream could take root, grow, and bloom. The workers' legacy. The engineers, masons, and gardeners who had built the gardens were long gone, but their work endured. Every stone terrace, every hidden channel, every carefully pruned branch was a testament to their skill and devotion. They had shaped not only a garden but a legacy. They had proven that human hands, guided by patience and care, could create wonders that spoke across centuries. And though the desert winds eventually carried dust across the terraces and some plants faded with time, the memory of their labor lived on. In every story told, in every poem written, in every whispered legend, the gardens breathed with life. The garden in imagination. Even when the gardens no longer existed as they once had, they continued to grow in the imagination. Travelers, poets, and dreamers envisioned terraces overflowing with greenery, streams sparkling like silver threads, and flowers unfolding in colors beyond description. Children imagined climbing stairways of stone into the clouds, guided by the songs of birds and the fragrance of blossoms. Adults remembered the cool shade, the gentle murmur of water, and the peace that had filled their hearts while walking among the terraces. In every mind that carried the story, the gardens remained, a paradise that could not be erased by time or desert sands, a symbol of hope. The hanging gardens became more than a marvel of Babylon. They became a symbol of what human beings could achieve when guided by love, devotion, and imagination. A symbol of the harmony between nature and human care. A symbol of longing transformed into creation. Even centuries later, when empires fell and cities were buried under sand, the gardens lived on in legend. They inspired builders to dream, poets to write, and dreamers to imagine beauty in the world. Their memory was a quiet reminder that even in desolation, life could flourish, and even in longing, beauty could rise. The whispering legacy. It was said that if one listened carefully, the gardens still whispered across time. The rustle of leaves, the gurgle of water, the scent of unseen flowers. They lived in stories, songs, and memories. Some believe that when a person closed their eyes and imagined the gardens, they could feel the cool stone beneath their feet, the gentle spray of water on their skin, and the warmth of the sun on leaves above. In that moment, the gardens returned, not as ruins, but as paradise reborn in the mind and heart. And so, the hanging gardens existed both in reality and in imagination, both in history and in dreams. Closing reflection. The hanging gardens of Babylon were more than stone terraces or flowing water. They were the embodiment of longing fulfilled, of love expressed, and of life nurtured. They were a place where the desert had been taught to bloom, where memory and reality intertwined, and where every visitor could experience a glimpse of heaven on earth. Centuries would pass, empires would rise and fall, and sands would cover streets and walls. Yet the gardens would endure in a different form, alive in stories, in hearts, in dreams. To imagine the gardens was to breathe in beauty, to feel patience, devotion, and love. To remember them was to carry a piece of paradise forever. And so, the hanging gardens of Babylon, though no longer seen by the world in their full glory, remained eternal in memory, a testament to what humans could create when they dared to dream.